Hello, everybody, and welcome to In Conversation. My name is James Campbell, and on today's podcast, I'm very pleased to be joined by Nicole Ozer, the Executive Director of the new Center for Constitutional Democracy at UC Law in San Francisco. Hey, Nicole, welcome to the podcast. Thanks for your time, and it's lovely to see you again and great to have you on. How's things?
Thanks so much. Pleasure to be with you. It was so nice to meet you earlier this fall and excited to be on the podcast and engaging in these important conversations.
Yeah, I guess for anyone out there who's wondering why it's so important to go to scholarly conferences, I guess it's these interactions that come from them. It was great to meet you at the 4S conference, and I think you was a lot of interesting different individuals representing a lot of different disciplines and a lot of different backgrounds, and of course people who are academics, but also people representing organizations such as yours. How did you find the conference? Do you have a lot of interesting interactions? Did it have any interesting conversations?
Yeah, I really enjoyed going to 4S. It was in Seattle this September, and the conference was just a couple of weeks before we publicly launched the new Center for Constitutional Democracy at UC Law San Francisco. So, had the chance to start to develop a network for that new center. And, one of the real goals of the center is to really be bridging across disciplines, bringing together scholars and practitioners and lawyers and people working in local communities to really, meet this moment and also continue to build for the future. So, the opportunity to be there and really connect with others about the work that we're doing at the new center, the work that we're doing across issue area, the work that we're doing across strategy in the courts, in the legislatures, community work, and really trying to translate scholarship into real action. In this moment where we can't open the newspaper, log on to social media, listen to the news, talk to our friends without sort of realizing just what a critical moment this is in terms of the fabric of democracy, our constitutional rights. And obviously we're in this moment when there's such a growth of artificial intelligence and other technology as well. So the confluence of the political moment and the technological moment as well is really exciting to be able to launch this new center and think about the work that we can be doing together, to, as again, meet this moment, but also continue to build for the future and think about, how we can really build the democracy that we all need and want, that is inclusive and supports everyone really having real rights and the ability and opportunity in their lives with their families.
Well, thanks for that initial sort of introduction. And I guess we were at the conference promoting our new book series, AI Politics, where I was just showcasing the inaugural kind of CFP, the call for papers for that, call for proposals for that book series. And I was overwhelmed by the interest. And I think it's partly because of the taking a slightly different approach, but I think it also speaks to what you've said of just how pertinent and important these topics are and how much fertile interdisciplinary research and conversations are being had around the world. And this conference 4S was very much kind of a really useful opportunity for me at least, to see how much was going on. And it was great to have you there and people representing law and constitutional democracy. But before we go any further, first of all, I'd like to offer you my congratulations, one, on setting up the center in the first place. And also, you're, of course, the inaugural executive director. So congratulations on the position and on getting that thing across the line. I imagine it was probably quite a lot of work.
Yes, yeah, we launched on Constitution Day, U.S. Constitution
Brilliant.
Day, which is September 17th. I am the inaugural executive director, so was hired to develop this new center. Previously, I worked at the ACLU here in California for more than 20 years. So I was hired in 2004 to develop the ACLU's first statewide work on the intersection of technology and rights and democracy. So my background My deep expertise, I'm trained as a lawyer, my deep expertise is really working across strategy to make technology work for the people and support rights and democracy. So this is actually a really exciting opportunity to continue the work that I have done, but even on a broader scale. And as I said, to build bridges across disciplines. I'm a lawyer. I have worked. I'm a lawyer, but I studied comparative civil rights history and sociology. So my mindset has always been, how can we use the law as a way to support social movements, support social change? And so I've always been very aligned with historians, with sociologists, with researchers, and what can we learn from history and how can we build power across issue areas and across disciplines to be able to meet the newest challenges, both sort of political, but also technological. And artificial intelligence is, I've actually, James, you and I talked about this a little bit, but one of the reasons why I stopped at the wonderful table of Intellect publications is both because you have this new series on artificial intelligence, and I've been working and researching, in addition to my new work at the Center for Constitutional Democracy. Last year, I was in a fellowship at the Harvard Kennedy School on technology and human rights. And I've really been doing some deep research into the history of the late 60s and early 70s and sort of the dawn of computerization and what we can learn from that moment in time, what we did and what we didn't do in terms of regulation, in terms of legal change, in terms of work on narrative and, building power, what worked in the late 60s and early 70s, and also what we sort of missed our moment to do then, and how we can learn from that to really think about advances in AI and how we really channel advances in artificial intelligence to drive access and equity and justice and actually support democracy rather than it being a tool for surveillance and other ways that may undermine rights and democracy. So I was telling you about this recent work I did called Golden State Sword, where I was really looking at the history of the California constitutional right to privacy. I can talk about that a little bit later, but really excited to think about how I use how this new center can really be both an intellectual hub, but also an action center, how we really take the scholarship, the amazing work that's happening across disciplines, we channel that into influential work on cases, being able to build, to buttress existing laws, to build new laws, and to really think about how technology and democracy are so, inextricably intertwined right now, and how we can really ensure that it is working for the people and working for democracy.
Well, I imagine there's quite a few people listening to this who are feeling a little bit more reassured hearing that somebody's out there looking into these things, because I know a lot of people feel with AI, it's obviously kind of a bit of the Wild West, and where the governments are slow to govern and to come up with laws and legislation. So maybe you could just talk a little bit to us about what's the sort of mission of the Center for Constitutional Democracy, if you will, and sort of, I guess, what makes it distinctive in today's landscape.
Yeah, I mean, what makes it distinctive is a few things. I mean, we are both an intellectual hub and want to really create a really effective network between scholars across disciplines to have more connected tissue about sort of what they're working on and how it's interconnected. But we want to also be translating that into real action. So we're both an intellectual hub, but also an action center, and sort of translating, bringing people together to understand the scholarship and its interconnections, but also how can we then utilize that scholarship in this moment, in cases that are moving through the courts, in state courts and federal courts up to the, state Supreme Courts and US Supreme Court. How can we translate scholarship into thinking about how we utilize existing law more effectively, or buttress existing law with ways that we can augment it to address, new challenges. And also, how can we think about, training the next generation as well to be thinking across issue, across discipline. In my field, we call it integrated advocacy, which is, seeing an issue and thinking about all the different strategies that one could utilize, everything from working in the courts to narrative change, building power, legislative work, scholarship as well. So, sort of de-siloing the thinking in terms of how to create change and support change. And I think another thing that's unique about the center is obviously sort of my positionality as the director. I come from 2 decades of work on the intersection of technology and democracy and rights. But I also am someone, having worked at the ACLU for as many years as I have, I've really been in that space where I have been a translator between sort of deep scholarship and action on the ground. So, there's some people who've worked on the scholarly side, there's some people who've worked on the grassroots action side, but it's somewhere like the ACLU, and particularly in the work I was doing on emerging technology, you're really, I had a real opportunity to work closely with scholars and think about how can we use, those innovative ideas that are coming out of scholarship, but how do we actually make them operational, feasible, practical in actual policy change? And so I think, my positionality of understanding how to do that, I think, already we're seeing that in the center, and sort of really being able to, translate the interest, the scholarly work of so many academics. People want to be involved, people want to have, to be able to maximize the impact of the work that they're doing. And the center will really be a great networking conduit. So if there are listeners who are doing scholarly work on democracy, on the impact of technology, on advancing rights, on thinking about how you use different strategies to do that, would love to think about ways to connect and collaborate on that.
Thanks, Nicole. You've mentioned the ACLU a couple of times there, and for any of our listeners who maybe aren't familiar with the ACLU or not based in the US, could you just very briefly just tell us what the role of the ACLU is?
Yeah, the ACLU is the American Civil Liberties Union. It's over 100 years old. It works, it works on constitutional law and civil rights issues. There are offices in every state in the US, on a national office in New York and Washington, D.C. And, as one of the taglines is, democracy doesn't defend itself. And so, the ACLU is a nonprofit that has worked in that area for more than 100 years and has more than 2,000 staff across the United States. So it was wonderful to spend 20 years at the ACLU developing some of the most innovative national campaigns and legal work. And I'm really bringing all of that knowledge and expertise and sort of positionality to this work at the center. Really working across legal strategy, also anticipating and proactively addressing threats to constitutional rights and civil rights due to advances in technology. But again, being in an academic center, also hopefully, I've seen the real power when you bring people together, when you bring together scholars, when you bring together practitioners, when you bring together people who are working in the grassroots, when you have the opportunity to even bring in, people from companies or the interfaith community. And so thinking about how we really build a stronger network, a stronger ability to be both translating scholarship into action, but also for action to be informing scholars. And so having that two-way communication where, energy that's happening on the ground in work can really start to influence scholars maybe being able to do more work that will create a virtuous cycle of being able to have scholarship and impact connected more, is something that really excites me about being at the center, and also being able to train and support the next generation. Sometimes people call social change, they say it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. But recently someone said to me, it's not a sprint or a marathon, it's actually a relay race.
You're right. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense. Yeah.
And that, at the beginning of my career, some amazing people mentored, supported me, trained me to do the work that I'm doing. And now 20 plus years later, it's really a privilege to be in an academic center and be able to work with students and other community members and think about how we're supporting the next generation and in thinking about not just how to use the law, but how to work across disciplines to meet this moment, to continue to build for the future, and hopefully, support the democracy we really do need and want.
Well, talking about meeting the moment, you've highlighted like how interconnected technology and democracy are, and certainly are at the moment. So from your perspective, what are perhaps some of the biggest constitutional challenges that the rise of AI poses to democratic governance and to the rights of the individual?
Big picture,
yeah,
rights are protected by friction or they're protected by law.
Right.
And right now, the rise of artificial intelligence greatly reduces the friction. And so, information is much more accessible. Obviously, we saw how DOGE was able to sort of infiltrate and access, federal agencies and deeply sensitive information with sort of the press of a button. Artificial intelligence also, superpowers surveillance systems. So again, rights are protected by law or they're protected by friction. And we've got sort of the rise of AI, and we also have a current administration, which is, pushing the boundaries, pushing to the edge and beyond the edge. And so we're also seeing how a lot of things that we thought were a given in sort of our democratic system, it turned out some of them were protected by norms of like, what did people think was okay to do versus, law itself. So we have sort of both this moment where we have an administration that's like pushing the boundaries and pushing to the very edge and beyond. And so we're seeing how, some of those things we thought were protected by our law actually start to crumble. And then we've got AI at the same time. So it's kind of both the political moment and the technological moment are combining to making this era, this moment that we're living in, depending on the decisions that are made, the actions that we as individuals take, the impact on the democracy, the democratic system we've understood to be in existence for a very long time is actually quite fragile, given the moments that we're in. So, democracy is being challenged on these many fronts while we're in the middle of massive changes in terms of technology. And so this is combining to create even greater challenges, which I think sort of my positionality of kind of understanding both of those pieces means that at the center, we're really thinking about how do we work on issues that are going to kind of address the understanding of what we're really dealing with in this moment, and how those two pieces are combining to create even greater challenges that we need to address, and think about how we sort of pave the way to possible for what needs to be coming next to actually not just defend democracy, but to continue to advance democracy and rights in the AI age.
With regard to the AI age, I feel like a lot of people were almost caught off guard, you know, with the rapid development and doubling that AI has achieved in what seems to be a fairly short period of time. And of course, Intellect was publishing its first journal in the early 80s, which was called the Artificial Intelligence Review. So obviously AI is nothing new, machine learning and large language models and these things, but it's certainly in the last kind of like post-COVID landscape, I think for your general layman, your general sort of Joe on the street type thing, I think the rapid development of AI and the huge effects it's having across the board, but especially around areas like democracy, misinformation, and creative practice and things of that nature, has really shocked people a bit. Were you guys like, did you see this coming? Were you planning for this, or has it kind of shocked you a little bit how fast things have developed and how tricky it's been for governments and legislators to kind of come in and enshrine protections in law when it comes to kind of AI? And again, forgive me if I get any of that wrong.
No. I actually think almost everyone was surprised. Even the big tech companies seemed surprised sort of how ChatGPT took off. I've had sort of some offline conversations with some of them. I have some friends who, got their PhD in artificial intelligence, in 2000, and they were, the tech companies kind of had them in a little, basement,
Right.
They've been there all those years, but they weren't kind of, where the money was. So I think that the difference is that there's sort of been this monetization or sort of move on AI. I think I've been somebody that tries to kind of learn from history and think about what we've been doing before. When I graduated from high school, and I graduated from high school in Palo Alto, California, sort of the epicenter of Silicon Valley. When I graduated, I had never heard of the internet. Right. And when I came back from college 4 years later, Yahoo had been founded. Everyone was talking about the World Wide Web. And so sort of we've had that moment, in the late 1990s. I've also been looking through the archives of sort of, the early 1970s. Again, we had this sort of very rapid modernization of sort of, the computer moving into people's like consciousness and people being able to sort of have access to computerization. I think what's important here, though, is that we're always going to have sort of these moments of sort of rapid technological growth. We even did it, when telephones were invented, and then all of a sudden people had telephones. What's important is to think about, okay, how can we actually utilize new technology in a way that supports rights, supports access, supports equity, supports opportunity, supports democracy? How do we build and develop the right kind of laws that will sort of channel that? Because, again, I'm from Silicon Valley. I'm a huge fan of technology and innovation. I believe in its power to make a difference. But like anything, it has to be channeled for, the good of rising all boats versus just profiting for the few. And that's what I've committed, what my career, I've spent my career working to ensure that technology supports people and rights and access and opportunity. And we're at that moment again. It's, AI is extremely powerful. It has the ability to do a lot of good, but it has to actually be channeled. And there actually has to be law that ensures that it moves in the direction of supporting people and rights. Law is always going to be a little slower than the technology itself, but we actually are able to pass laws quite quickly on the state level.
Well, that's actually the question I was going to interrupt you then and just say, it seems like California is a little bit ahead of the rest of the country, or certainly a lot of states, when it comes to legislating. And I was just wondering if maybe you'd just tell us a little bit about state law and the role of California. And of course, they recently passed is it SB 53, I think, the AI safety law. So how significant is that legislation, and how might that sort of influence or pressure other states or even the federal government to kind of act? Or do you...
Yeah, I mean, California has always been a leader in technology policy. It's been a leader since the dawn of the computer age in the early 1970s. So, California has been at the forefront of technology policy law and passing, laws that are thoughtful, that understand the technology and understand and support, channeling technology to actually be able to support rights and, lift all boats rather than just profit for a few. California, we can talk a little bit more about this later, but California in 1972 passed a constitutional right to privacy that was specifically addressed sort of the modern rise of computerization. So for 50 years, California has been at the forefront. And contextually, Congress and the president have not signed a meaningful privacy technology law since 1994. So, 30 plus years. In the last administration, there was executive action, and sort of federal agencies were making some significant moves on artificial intelligence. There was the AI Bill of Rights. Agencies like the Federal Trade Commission and the Consumer Financial Protection Board were doing some important work on AI, but that has all been swept away by the current administration. So California is really where the action is, given that nothing has been moving through Congress, and any executive action that was, supporting rights or democracy related to AI was completely swept away. So California is where the action is. Last year, more than 24 AI laws were signed into law. We're just at the very end of the California legislative session this year. The governor has just a couple more days to sign or veto laws. So we've seen a couple of laws already signed. You mentioned SB 53. So there's legislative action that's happening, important laws getting signed. There's also a lot of action in the California executive agencies as well. The governor's office, the California Privacy Agency, other agencies. So, I have a whole slide deck on, actions happening in California. So if there are any listeners who, want access to that or want to add that to one of their classes or one of their presentations, just reach out. I recently just lectured on that issue for a Hot Topics in AI class at Berkeley Law. So happy to share those resources with anybody.
Excellent, thank you. It seems like the state has brought in some new guidelines as well around evaluating AI's impact on vulnerable and marginalized people. Could you just maybe tell us a little bit about those kind of guidelines and if they'll be implemented, and how do you think they're going to be implemented by either tech companies or by federal government, or I should say the state public agencies and state government?
Yeah. I mentioned that there's a lot of action on the executive level in California and in the California agencies. California Governor Gavin Newsom issued an executive order more than a year ago on deployment and use of AI by state agencies, and really encouraging use of AI. But related to that executive order, there was a process where they also asked for input on guidelines for agency deployment of AI. And as part of that process, my colleagues and I submitted some really lengthy comments about, the importance of asking thoughtful questions about why to use AI and whether to use AI and the benefits of using AI versus the potential costs, both in terms of money, but also in terms of rights and opportunity. So to ask the what and why and whether before you get to just the how of AI. And those comments are actually a prime example of translating scholarship into action, because we worked with the Samuelson Clinic students and scholars at Berkeley Law to develop those comments. And those comments, which included sort of there needs to be a real assessment of the why and whether before the how. Also the need to include an AI impact assessment and really the center the voices and needs of impacted people, particularly diverse communities in California, and to actually evaluate those kinds of pilot systems and see if they're really working in the way that they're intended versus having unintended consequences. Those comments that we submitted, many of those recommendations were then reflected in the guidelines that were promulgated for state agencies for deployment of AI. So those guidelines came out in December 2024. They're online. Anyone can read those. They're also in my slide deck that I mentioned earlier about action in California. And so really glad to see that, you know, many of those recommendations ended up in the final guidelines. There's more to be done in that area, and that's some work that I'm going to be rolling out from the center, thinking about sort of more of a civil rights framework for AI deployment, particularly by local agencies. But, you know, contextually in California, you know, California is the 4th largest economy in the world. You know, it has a massive state budget. 1 in 8 people in the entire United States live in California. So the laws that pass in California, the guidelines that are deployed in terms of how California agencies utilize AI, those are incredibly important, not just for Californians, but how that also sort of influences how AI is considered and thoughtfully considered sort of more broadly, particularly in the absence of you know, federal guidelines on these issues anymore. So was proud to see some of those recommendations make it into the final guidelines. And again, more work needs to happen, and that's something that I'm going to be working on with the center. And if there's anyone else, any listeners who are interested in AI governance on the local level, on the state level, and also thinking about how we really shift power and make sure that impacted communities have a real, not, you know, it's not just their input, but they have a real opportunity to really influence the decision making. That's an issue I'm exploring right now and thinking about how we can draft some models to accomplish that, and would love to connect with others on that issue.
Just jumping around a little bit, you know, in a recent essay, you've warned against a digital coup against democracy. I was just wondering what you might mean by that phrase, and what are the risks that you're most concerned about when it comes to AI and democratic participation? Yeah,
I mean, you know, how technology is built and used obviously can control our daily lives. It can influence our system of governance. It can undermine the rights and knowledge and institutions that are critical for a well-functioning democracy. I mean, we already saw Doge in action. And so when I talk about sort of a digital coup, it goes back to, you know, that rights and the fabric of democracy are protected by friction or they're protected by law. And right now with artificial intelligence, we see, and you know, the computing power, we see the friction going way, way down. And we also have an administration that's wanting to push the limits of, you know, the law and beyond the law. And so when I talk about a digital coup, you know, when we lived in a more analog age, you know, to get access to everyone's social security numbers, or, you know, Medicare information, or try to get access to, you know, databases that were on the local level, those databases were file drawers of paper. You know, when you talk about friction, like, you couldn't do that with the push of a button with, you know, for 20 somethings who worked for Doge in Washington, DC, but now you can. And so the fact that that's a technological reality means we need to have more law to protect, just because something's possible doesn't mean you should do it. But what makes it not able to be done is no longer the technological impediment, the friction, but you must have the legal impediment. That's why it's so important to defend current law and also to build new law to strengthen those buttresses of democracy.
Well, thank you for that answer, and I love your friction. It's all about law and friction. I like this analogy. I've not heard it described in such a way before, but it's a really useful way of thinking about things, I think. So thank you for sharing that. I wanted to ask a little bit about looking to the future as well, and in sort of 5 years' time, what would success look like for you with regard to the Center for Constitutional Democracy, especially in light of all the rapid developments and change that's going on now? Are you just trying to kind of like keep a lid on things, or what changes in law, policy, or culture would signal sort of real progress as far as you're concerned, especially when it comes to protecting rights and justice in the AI age?
Yeah, I mean, one of my main reasons for coming to be the inaugural executive director for the center is because, I don't want to just keep a lid on things. I want to build the path for where we need to be going next. I have a lot of colleagues who are doing amazing work on defense right now, and we absolutely need to do that. We need to, people need to be in the courts, pushing back on exactly what I'm talking about in terms of Doge and other things that are happening sort of across challenges. But if we spend all our time on defense, then we're not going to have a plan for how we get to where we need to go next. There were hundreds of lawsuits filed in the first Trump administration. Those were incredibly important lawsuits, but here we are, in 2025. And so, given the work that I have done the last 2 decades, really building on that work and thinking about what are the interventions we can do that really build for the future, that respond to the moment now, but also continue to build for the future. And again, sort of on the technology space, my mission has always been, building a world where technology works for the people. And on AI, it's really, okay, are we actually asking sort of the why and whether, before just getting to the how? A lot of times, the tech companies or government just want to, they want to say it's inevitable, that we should just sort of jump into the inevitability box.
Yeah.
And a lot of that is narrative. As I said, I've been looking through the archives. It's exactly the same narrative in the early 1970s. Right. You could literally take testimony from 1972 and use it word for word in a congressional hearing today on AI. So, and the same narratives were used, by the companies that were pushing back against regulation. They said, well, this is going to be good for society, and, people are going to have more access to doctors, and, we're going to streamline social services. But there needs to actually be law that channels that in the right direction. And so, one of my goals at the center is really also bringing to light, how can we learn from what we did and didn't do 50 years ago and actually, think about the right interventions now, where we are really channeling the immense potential benefits of technology and actually using it in ways that really support people rather than just profit for a few. And then also, I've worked my first 20 years of my career on the intersection of technology and rights and democracy. I think even just your questions and your understanding how technology is just so intertwined with democracy has been a real advance in people realizing that technology issues are not just sort of these siloed, tangential, more esoteric, geeky issues, that they actually, how technology is used, how it's built, the decisions we make about it, how people understand it, how they push for it to be used in ways that really support people is actually integral to our rights and to our democracy. And so that's also a goal, is to continue to have people, understand how technology and democracy are not siloed issues, but they are in lockstep together. And then just broader, I'm just building the center now. The inaugural executive director, we just launched on September 17th. And I would, my goal in 5 years is to have it be a vibrant, center with, more staff, more ability to make an impact. And so hopefully there will be opportunities to collaborate with listeners, and hopefully there will be people who'd like to support the center. The center's not taking any state money, so we have a lot of ability to do work across issue area, but that also means that we'll need foundations and individual supporters to be able to maintain the center and grow. So that's one of my goals too within the next 5 years, to really make it a sustainable and vibrant intellectual hub and action center that's based in California, but is really an epicenter for important work that's happening across the country and across the world.
Well, let me ask you then, if anyone wants to find out more about the center, or to sort of get in touch, whether they represent a foundation and they might be able to help make it more sustainable financially, or they just want to get in work at more of a grassroots level, how can people find out a bit more and get involved?
Yes, if people want to learn more about the Center for Constitutional and Democracy, get engaged with Collaborative Project, or support the center, with your time or with your resources, if you're a foundation or an individual donor, we have a new website. It's at www.uclawsf.edu/we-the-people. So uclawsf.edu, we the people. So, or you can just do a search for Nicole Ozer, Center for Constitutional Democracy, or you can find me on LinkedIn as well.
Great. Well, thank you for sharing all of that information. It's always good to pop some of that up on screen at the end. But let me ask you just a couple of final questions. And I wanted to ask you, it's a bit of a big question, but I've asked some of our AI politics editors the same question, so I feel like maybe it's an appropriate one for you. I just wanted to, with your insight and insider perspective, would you share with us maybe one of your fears about AI in the future? But then also, let's end it on more of a positive note, and perhaps you can give us one of your hopes as well, because I know there's a lot of benefits around AI, whether it be in medicine or in education, etc. So, it'd just be interesting to hear your fear, and then also one of your hopes for the future.
I guess my greatest fear is that history will repeat itself. I've been looking through the archives of the early 1970s and see literally, the same narratives, the same talking points. And as somebody who studied history and sociology and law, I would love to see us learn from what we did and didn't do in the 1970s and 80s and 90s, and do it better this time. So my greatest fear is that we don't learn from history. And my greatest hope is that we do learn from history, and we learn what we could have done, and we actually take action to do it now. And with that, I've written this paper, Golden State Sword. I have a new article that will be coming out soon from the Harvard Kennedy School, which is about learning from history and putting power into US privacy law. And for those listeners also, we just launched the center, but we're going to have an amazing symposium on November 14th on the rule of law and democracy in person at UC Law, or you can join online. The California Attorney General, Rob Bonta, will be there. Berkeley Law Dean Erwin Chemerinsky will be giving a keynote. There's a full day of panels, and then a reception to launch the new Center for Constitutional Democracy. So you can log in anywhere. It's free, no charge to watch the symposium. And also hope that if there are listeners who are interested in democracy, who are researching and writing and engaging on these issues, that you reach out for collaborative projects, or if you're having symposia or events at your own institution, would love to hear about it. Happy to come and participate in those events, or just connect and be thought partners on projects that we might be doing. So very collaborative, and really looking forward to building a broader network. And I will be at the Law and Society Conference as well in San Francisco at the end of May. So if you all are going to be there, hope to see you there as well in downtown San Francisco, just like UC Law San Francisco. So it will be in our hometown, and we'll be excited to connect with people across the country and the world who will be at the conference.
Brilliant. Well, Nicole, thank you so much for your time today. It's been really fascinating getting some insights in what you and the center are doing. And I mean, thank you for all the work that you're doing as well. It seems vitally important. And I think that so few people actually understand that there are these kinds of checks and balances, and there are these people and institutions in place that are looking at these things. Because you often hear it's a podcast, and there's a tech leader on there talking about, well, there's all these negative things, but it's okay because it'll work itself out. And I think people are getting more and more sort of disturbed, and there's a lot of mythologies and misinformation. So I think a lot of our listeners will really appreciate having your, straight fact-based, no nonsense kind of approach to it. So thank you very much for sharing that today. And are there any final thoughts from you? Anything you wanted to say?
Just that, on that note, there's a lot of existing law that we can be using more effectively. I've been doing a deep dive into the California constitutional right to privacy. I have an extensive article called Golden State Sword, which is online now. And I'm also going to be doing some deeper work on the California constitutional right to privacy, how we can more effectively utilize it to defend and advance rights and democracy in the AI age. So would love any feedback from folks on the article. And again, it's deeper work that I'm doing. So if anyone is interested in connecting about that, or symposia or events that could benefit from sort of a state perspective on how we can utilize state law sort of through the last 50 years and the most current laws that are also being passed, would love to connect with folks about that work.
Well, Nicole, thank you again for your time. It's been such a pleasure. And to everyone else, we'll see you here again for the next episode of In Conversation. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.